Good evening. I'm Helen Nicholson, ASHA's event coordinator, and I would like to welcome you to ASHA's talk this evening, Architecture for a Nervous Landscape, Defensive Buildings in the New South Wales Colony, 1788 to 1850. Before handing over to our speakers, Stephen and Cameron, I would like to acknowledge that I am zooming in from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to First Nations people past, present and emerging. Stephen Gapps is one of Australia's leading historians, researching and writing in the field of the Australian frontier wars. He has a background in military history and its significance and public commemoration. Stephen has published several books, including most recently Uprising, War in the Colony of New South Wales, 1838 to 1844. Our other speaker tonight is Cameron Logan, who is a historian of architecture and cities. He has a particular interest in the history and cultural salience of heritage conservation. He is the author of Historic Capital, Preservation, Race and Real Estate in Washington, D.C., and is a former editor of Fabrications, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand. About our talk tonight, over 20 years ago, Dennis Byrne described the spatial logic of racial segregation in Australia as a nervous landscape. The nervousness of that racial order was built on colonial violence. Remarkably, however, the heritage system and much public interpretation of colonial places remains tethered to an idea of colonial buildings as representations of peaceable settlement. In tonight's talk, they will introduce their new research project that challenges assumptions that have underpinned several decades of colonial architecture, architectural history and heritage in Australia. Cameron and Stephen will highlight the aims of their project, which involves a more systematic assessment and analysis of such evidence, and highlights some examples. We're in for a treat tonight. Well, I'll ask you, if you do have any questions for Stephen and Cameron, can you please put them in the chat? Thank you. And it's over to you two.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, we're going to do this as a bit of a two-hander, and I'll hand over to Stephen. But I just wanted to underline for people that this is research, not even research in progress, I guess you would say. Although, as you'll hear from Stephen, he certainly had a bit of a look at some of this stuff, and there's a reason we got into it, and he in particular. But it is prospective research. We are currently seeking support for this research, and so what we're going to lay out, I suppose, is the groundwork on which we're trying to the basis upon which we're seeking that support, and give a bit of a sense, I guess, of where we hope for the research to go. Yeah, so thanks, Helen. I'll hand over to Stephen, who's going to take the first bit.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron, and thanks, Helen and ASHA, for having us along tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners from where I'm coming from, on the corner of Bidjigal, Wongal and Gadigal lands at Gubramora, or sunny Marrickville. Yeah, so to start with, I thought I'd just kind of work through how, firstly, I got interested in this area. I hope some of you may know my work. Firstly, the Sydney Wars was. I've been working on Australian frontier wars histories for at least 10 years, and the first major work was the Sydney Wars, which came out in 2018. Now, the research for that was really sparked by a talk I was at that was by Henry Reynolds, who said he and other frontier wars historians for the last 30 odd years or more, have covered the big picture in that area in frontier wars history. But there was a real need for historians to look at local areas. And that got me interested in looking at where I'm from Sydney, and looking at it in terms of wondering why initially there'd been tens of thousands of words and hundreds of books written about early colonial Sydney, but nothing as a comprehensive study of the resistance warfare that occurred. And, historians mention this, but as part of an early colonial story. And so I went out on a limb and decided to pull together essentially a history of the resistance warfare that occurred around Sydney. And if we go to the slide, Cameron, that shows a map of this conflict. So once I started looking into it from 1788 to 1816, which is kind of an endpoint for warfare across the Sydney region, with Macquarie's military campaigns, which you may know about, in 1816 that ended in the Appin massacre. Once you start to map out all the raids, the attacks, the battles, and the massacres, you see that there's patterns of where that occurred, and there's also periods of intense conflict, particularly 1814 to 1816, which is another, which was part of the Sydney Wars story, but it's another project that I'm delving into more deeply. So while I was working on that, I visited a lot of those locations and came across, particularly in the southwest region, a series of buildings that showed fortification elements. Now, I guess as having a bit of an interest in military history, I'd always had an eye out for what the British military in Sydney, and not just the military, but other settlers on the edges of settlement, were doing in terms of fortifications. And it's largely been either dismissed or written about as, well, there was no need for fortifications or any kind of defensive works in Sydney. But actually, when you look at it, the first structure in Sydney Cove was a redoubt, a little fort. The first structure in Parramatta was again a redoubt or a fort. And they may be minor structures, but they are there. And some of the work I've been doing later in the 1830s and 40s, where the frontier gets pushed out towards central west New South Wales, down into Victoria, where you look at the towns that we know today, Albury, Benalla, and others along what used to be called the Hume Highway. The first buildings were military outposts in those towns. Now, in histories of those places, these are not the celebrated foundational moments of cities, towns, and places, that they were military outposts. And they may not have been forts. They may have just been, a bark hut, a slab hut to begin with. But they may have included a stockade as well. And there were quite a few stockades, examples of stockades. So in that research, I ended up being told about some stone structures with rifle slit windows. And if we go to the next slide, Cameron, down in Appin in southwest Sydney. Now, this is where Governor Macquarie's 1816 military campaign that swept across the Sydney region ended up near Appin and came into conflict with Ganagara and Dharawal people, and Major Wallace's detachment decimated a group of people there. It's Sydney's largest massacre event. The thing about that is it's not just the massacre. Before that, there was a battle at Razorback, the Razorback Range, which was an Aboriginal victory, part of the reasons for Macquarie's campaign. And there was a period of intense conflict from 1814 to 1816 that really terrorized that southwest region, and that was the reason for that significant campaign. So it was interesting when I came across this structure, this granary building at the Vines, and you can see if we go to the next slide, it was constructed with rifle slit windows. Now that's interesting, and it's also interesting to me that the conservation management plan for that building had very few words about the nature of it, and this is the same as other buildings that the question was presented: is this possibly a defensive element? The thing was that once I started to look into this, it was at least five other buildings in that area also had rifle slit windows. Now this was an area that was settled from 1812. A lot of these structures, these initial structures, it's really hard to work out when they were built. Often these outbuildings were built before the homestead structure. So they may have been built, some of them may have been built around that 1816 period or just after. And what got me interested as well was that if they were built just after, were they built with the memory of that intense conflict in mind? Or potentially were they built with, and this was common right across the early colony, with several uses and functions in mind, as storage, as ventilation, as some kind of traditional element, but also as a defensive place against attacks by not just warriors, but from the 1820s bushrangers, and potentially escaped convicts as well. So this and I guess for me, even if it was built with all those reasons in mind, I still think it's really important that we start to focus on the strength of the resistance that may have produced these structures. And I guess I've looked also at the Bathurst region in detail in my book Good Yarra, which is about the Bathurst War, 1822 to 1824. And a similar thing occurred once I started researching and visiting locations. People started telling me about, oh, there's a building out there with rifle slit windows. Did you know about that? And of course, I was interested. One of the best examples there for me was that there was it was identified as 1830s structure built by Samuel Terry, and a granary building with rifle slit windows. But interestingly, Terry had moved from had moved to that location from an earlier location in the 1820s, which was absolutely was burnt down. His stock workers were killed, and it was part of this incredible resistance warfare by Windradine and his warriors in the 1820s. Now, I haven't found any evidence that Terry then constructs a granary building with that past history of his property being annihilated in mind, but it's certainly I think as part of this project worthy of investigation. I guess the other thing I think we mentioned briefly before was that there's been work on this in this area in Queensland and South Australia that have identified dozens, if not more, of structures, early colonial structures that were built with rifle slit windows in particular. They're not the only defensive element in this architecture, but they're a significant one. A lot of them are the first buildings on the frontier, and a lot of those are slab huts with auger holes to shoot from, or drop down windows, other kind of typical defensive features of huts, which will not be present in the Sydney landscape as much, but they were definitely noted, and there's definitely I've uncovered a lot of records of people talking about how the first huts on a squatter's run were set up with rifle slits in them. So I think that's going to be an important part of this this project. Yeah, and I think that's probably the main elements. I think you go to the next slide, Cameron. And this is Beulah Homestead, one of the other properties in Appin. If you go to the next slide, at the rear has an outbuilding, and the next slide has another type of rifle slit window. And this is one of a series of buildings in that area that have these defensive elements, or potentially defensive elements, I should say. We're not seeing rifle slit windows in every building, but there's a surprising amount in that area where that intense conflict occurred. And I think that's one of the things that we want to match up, to see if there is this correlation of resistance warfare and defensive architecture. And on that note, I'll hand over to Cameron.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so Stephen's work, for those of you who know it, has created is a really archivally rich, dense set of accounts, often newspaper based, of that people just hadn't looked at before, just to hear about where these patterns of conflict occurred. And the fact that he's built this map, not just here for the Sydney Wars, but also for the subsequent books, including most recently Uprising, which covers a vast territory from the Moreton Bay region down to almost the Port Phillip area. So the full scope of New South Wales as it was prior to 1850. And so that has been a sort of a prompt, I guess, for us to think, well, what other evidence is there beyond that really rich archival evidence that Stephen's turned out to in effect support, and for us to help deepen and enrich our understanding of what it is we're looking at. And so to begin with, I suppose, you're looking at his mapping here of conflict in Sydney. And when I was first exposed to this through that work, I was struck a little bit by, of course, the overlay, or the way in which this mapped onto the sort of lionized or valorized early colonial heritage that has come to us through the architecture of colonial Australia, and thought, oh well, that's interesting. We always see these buildings, or those of us who've studied architecture and architectural history always see these buildings, and where's the, is there something in, I guess, what was drawn or highlighted by the early architectural historians that reveals, I suppose, something of this story. And I guess, and I'll come back to that in a second, but that's sort of what got me interested. And the way we then framed this and thinking about it was because Stephen's work obviously highlights that this was both at a very local level, but then as you zoom out in a sense and start to look at the recent work of his from Uprising at that wider scale, this was indeed a kind of a nervous landscape. There's so much reportage, there's so much telling us that people were, that the settler society was anxious. They did not know, essentially, every time someone pushed beyond, limits of location, or not every time, but there's a huge amount of evidence there in what Stephen's turned out that shows that conflict ensued. And so for us, it was this idea that we encountered through Dennis Burns' work was a natural framing for it, even though I think what he's actually talking about is a kind of racial order of settlement on the Australian continent, a sort of product of settlement very widely that is not about early colonial settlement. But we thought the idea could be sort of pushed back into that early colonial period as a framing or way of thinking about it, because it was very evident from the archival evidence that there is a lot of anxiety there. And so we thought, well, how about we push at this and we think about it in terms of the buildings? And Stephen had already highlighted, and I was aware through places like Denby, which I'd been taken to by conservation architects and others, and Denby, which is in southwest Sydney. It's is it Orielton? No, that's the other house. Also down in this part of Sydney, where the owner of the house and the conservation architect had said, well, there's rifle slits here, there's defensive elements of these buildings. And so I was like, well, this is pretty interesting. Curiously, for those of you who are aware of, I guess, the early Australian historiography, and some of you maybe or some aren't, that sense of anxiety is completely absent. In fact, quite the opposite. If you look at the work of someone like Hardy Wilson and his very famous book, Old Colonial Architecture in New South Wales and Tasmania, you get a diametrically opposed point of view from a sort of anxious landscape in which conflict is everywhere, and you actually get a kind of remarkable sense of peacefulness. Now, of course, that requires that we think through what's his project, what's he doing, when's he writing about this this landscape. And of course, he's publishing his book in 1924 based on a 10-year project he undertook between 1912 and 1922 to document, the surviving old colonial buildings, sometimes out of the way, sometimes as prominent as buildings like the Hyde Park Barracks and other buildings in Macquarie Street, sometimes in many cases out of the way on the back roads in Tasmania and in southwest, or what became southwest Sydney, around places like Appin, Camden, and so on, as well as down as far as Goulburn and up to Richmond and Windsor and so on. So through that whole landscape, he's really trying to sort of construct in this project an image of a settler gentry, I suppose, is the way he talks about it. And he's also trying to find the reason his book has become significant for Australian architecture. In a way, he's trying to sort of establish a pedigree, a way of going back to the past and finding a sort of thread that architects in his moment, a century after most of these buildings were constructed, could find a kind of legitimating, somehow original source for how they go about building in the 1920s, 30s, and whatever, in his own moment. And so his kind of his approach, his project to document these early colonial buildings and to create a sort of narrative of early Australian architecture ends up with sort of, I think, two important implications that set a sort of background for our thinking. And one is, in the short term for him, he's trying to do just what I spoke about. He's trying to create this sort of pedigree and say, well, all this terrible Victorian and Edwardian architecture which surrounds us is a disaster. It's stylistically confused. We need some sort of sense of order and a kind of rule of taste introduced into our built environment. So that's the first thing. That's the thing that has more consequences in some ways for the story of how of sort of the architectural design in Australia, and not so much what we're interested in here. The second and longer term kind of implication of his work is that it provides a kind of visual shorthand in a way, and a language, as an architectural language for the heritage movement in Australia. His drawings are reproduced over and over by the National Trust, especially in New South Wales, but also in Tasmania and other states. They're distributors' postcards. They're the kind of almost the brand of the National Trust. And through this sort of iterative process, they become a kind of a way of sort of in which I suppose there's a link established in people's minds between these buildings and Australianness in the built environment itself. And so he's an important figure in that respect in terms of this bequeathing this set of images that will become so important to the way we imagine the past, imagine it visually and architecturally. But what's really extraordinary, as I already sort of alluded to about this story is, and the book, is his brief introduction, only about 12 pages long, and composed in part of some stuff he'd published earlier, including in his 1919 book, The Cow Pasture Road, documenting, I guess, the sort of cultural landscape of that part of southwest Sydney along the Cow Pasture Road. And so what he doesn't just create a kind of story about an origin story for the Australian house, which is, I guess, and a kind of a sort of a pointer for good taste in architecture in his own day that comes from a sort of untutored and direct response to the landscape. This is kind of his way of writing about it. He's quite insistent that these places are very explicitly evidence of the peaceable settlement of the early colonial period. So for us, this is the sort of ideological work he's doing is very obvious, and in a way gives us a counterpoint against which we can start to investigate what is absent, what is invisible in what he's talking about, because he's so almost insistent upon the peaceable quality. And I'll just highlight for you a couple of things he says. So in the introduction, again, he's quoting here from his own work. And in fact, he quotes this. He's so keen on this little passage that he not only publishes this in The Cow Pasture Road, he quotes it in his essay when he contributes an essay called Building Purulia, a story about building his own house in Wahroonga, which he contributes to a book also published in 1920, in fact, by Sidney Ure Smith, called Domestic Architecture in Australia, which is kind of, again, highlighting the importance of sort of imposing or suggesting there should be a rule of taste for Australian architecture. He says this in each of these three books from 1919, 1920, 1924. He says that pioneer squires, the sort of colonial gentry, chose serene summits, that they had no extremes of climate to contend with, and feared no hostile invasions. They built with taste and imagination, settling their white-walled homes like snowflakes on cushions of verdure. Tranquility surrounded them, thus situated like little monarchs on their own hilltops, at the head of assigned garrisons. They saw the world at their feet without thought of conquest. In other words, quite extraordinary. He uses, weirdly, some sort of martial imagery in that quote, but he also makes a very explicit claim that this was a completely peaceable landscape. Yes, this is the same landscape Stephen has spent the last 10 years highlighting was replete with conflict. And so how can these two things be true at the same time? Well, obviously they're not. And we know that Wilson's own moment in terms of his post-World War One, or his during World War One and post-World War One, when he's actually publishing and articulating what this group of buildings means in terms of Australian history and Australian settlement, is a moment of backward-looking nationalism. in which a sort of idea of what is true and good about the Australian settlement could be found in the past. In fact, especially by leaping back over that more dynamic, more complex history, which had taken place over the previous 4 or 5 decades, which involved significant urbanisation, uh, greater sort of social complexity in terms of the composition of Australian population, back to some idea of, these of an Australian colonial society dominated by these squires, these gentry settlers. And so for us, that implied, I guess, well, what's going on here? Why is he so insistent upon this? And for me, as a historian, you're always thinking, well, when anyone's so insistent and so obviously ideological on one level, there's got to be something else happening. Now, of course, he's partly a product of his own time, but so for us, the question straight away is, well, in fact, it almost seems like these two things, the one must almost point to the opposite, that this insistence on the peaceable environment is in fact a way of suppressing what is in fact a much more complicated and riven environment and an anxious landscape, as we've said. And so this leads us to, in a sense, design a research project built on that question of how do we, on one hand, address this question, this I guess an abiding myth which underpins not only the story of architectural development in Australia, but in a sense the heritage movement as it's evolved in Australia. How can we address that, and how can we take what Stephen's identified in the archive and push that out and I suppose see where it's also manifesting as in the built environment through, in particular, defensive structures, the ways in which people built and imagined themselves in the landscape as threatened, not their little monarchs on their hills, but perhaps people under threat in the midst of potential conflict. And so to do that, I guess this is the very basic sort of ambition of a project. We're setting out to discover where, how, and why defensive buildings and structures were built in New South Wales between 1788 and 1850, and asking what these places can teach us about conflict and the sense of anxiety and insecurity that characterised the settler society in that period. And to do that, so that's what we hope to achieve. But our method for doing it, I guess, is mixed. And what we're really trying to do is do 3 things: to go back to the archives, many of which Stephen's already been to uncover where we can evidence that this was also a matter of how buildings were constructed, how the environment was shaped on behalf of a sort of defensive intent. To then follow up by going to real places, in particular places where we already know there's evidence of this, like in the places in Bathurst and down at Appin and other places that Stephen already mentioned when he was talking. But I think most importantly, and our most productive potential method is actually just speaking and getting this project out there amongst those who know these geographies better than we do. And Stephen knows them pretty well now from his period working on them, but that's a whole lot of people. That's, locals, the local historical societies, local property owners, and it's also historians, heritage consultants, and others who've done research on places where these places are. And so our real intent is to, I guess, because if we just take this really expansive geography of New South Wales in the period from kind of, I guess the 1790s through to the 1840s, it's a huge, it's a fishing expedition in a lot of ways. We have some very good clues. So what we really need is your help and the help of your colleagues and others you might know, and local people you might have engaged with through work, And so that's why we're basically at this point, at the very beginnings of this project, trying to get out there and talk about it, and recruit people into it. Not, I guess, not explicitly to recruit, employ, but to recruit people in terms of their knowledge. And we've already had people, I guess, coming to us with examples that Stephen mentioned, and highlighting where there are other examples. And Caitlin, I can see, has joined, sent us something about Windmill Hill the other day, which was great, and is a building that looks very much like those ones as Stephen showed earlier at Appen. So I'll leave that there for the moment, and I guess Stephen, if you want to add anything in terms of the way we think about how you see what we're trying to achieve out of the project, before I guess opening up for questions or input ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. Just quickly on the idea of summits and hills. In my mind, it's as part of Hardy Wilson's serene, benign environment. I think it's really interesting too that summits and hills are chosen for defensive reasons as well as the outlook. The other point I just wanted to quickly make was about the imperial context of this, and I've looked at some overseas examples where there were pattern books for making domestic defensive architecture. It doesn't occur so much here, but I think part of it might be that we need to do some comparative analysis in terms of the imperial context. But I think the main thing, as Karen was saying, was about strengthening the historical archive and adding this material layer of evidence. And I think with the Frontier Wars, it's been about, the historiography has been very much about, well, back in the 1800s, colonists knew their history. They knew what had happened, and it was written out by the late 1800s, early 1900s, swamped by this new national history. I think that what Frontier Wars historians are doing is an historical revisionism that really needs to happen. But that's in history. And I think it's really important that we look at the built environment as part of this. And I think, this might be perhaps the first project that really does that sort of interrogation. And just as a final point, I think it's rethinking this architectural heritage is also a part of a broader truth-telling project that this revisionism is also about. And I think that's another important factor in all this.
Yeah. And I think that's very, very important to our other partner, who we should have mentioned also, who's working with us in this project, Dallas Rogers, who's been very insistent that it's not to lead truth telling. It's not really the role of settler historians to do, but to empower that with knowledge built through research, and that where that becomes available, and where First Nations people think that empowers the truth telling process, that they have that as a resource that can build those and strengthen those events that they're increasingly wanting to sort of join in and lead and champion. But yeah, Helen, thanks. We will. I guess that's us. So
thank you from us, because I tell you what is really fascinating listening to what you were both saying is that really it's right at the start of a project that really you're just going to find out so much. And I do hope that people do contact, that you do get lots of information, because look, the thing is that you are so right with that. Late 19th century, mid 19th century, people knew what had happened in the landscape. They knew that had happened in the local area, and it does just get white. I know from my own research, it does just get whitewashed. So, yeah, I love looking at Hardy Wilson and then looking at the reality, so it's a fascinating project. I do hope that you're going to come back and give ASHA members a little bit of an update as you sort of delve deeper into it. So we do.
We might have something a bit more solid in about 2 years if we
I
get.
know, but that's what's so exciting for us is that it's right at the beginning. So there's a lot that can feed into it. So we've got here that coming in a question. Caitlin Allen is saying thank you, that she looks forward to hopefully to a site visit to Windmill Hill sometime soon. Is that possible? Dan Winwood, in terms of the imperial context, to the North Island of New Zealand, the wars of the 1850s to the 1860s have left their architectural mark. Consider St Bride's Church, Mayuka in southern Auckland, which was fitted with rifle slots in 1863, and the stockade due to the position of on the border. There's been a lot of work and general awareness of the New Zealand wars over the past 10 years. So, yep. Now, for contacts, there's another one coming in. Dennis saying some Hawkesbury local historians believe that the remains of the Cat-Eye windmill, now in Cat-Eye National Park, are roughly opposite Ebenezer, and roughly opposite Ebenezer was a deliberate refuge in the case of attack in the early 1800s in date. So that's coming in from Dennis. So you're at Sydney, Cameron. So if people want to contact you, then they just need to put cameron.logan@sydney.edu.au and
we welcome all and any. Did Stephen, did you want to perhaps did you want to return to the question, the comment from Dan? I think perhaps you had a little bit more to say on that, because that's precisely where you sort of ended, and say a little bit more perhaps about that intercolonial or imperial context, and some of the work and some of the people you contacted from the UK, and some of the, I guess, other stuff about defensive evidence in the Caribbean and so on, in different context, obviously. Did you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, just briefly, because there's a lot more to do on that. But in the Caribbean, there's some incredible examples of transporting Scottish border architecture basically to Jamaica in response to slave rebellions. So that's one thing. I'm really interested in the idea of a windmill as a refuge from I think it was Dennis. The idea of a refuge is really a key, I think, in terms of the domestic response on the frontier, domestic architectural response. And it's common that the first building was a refuge and stayed as a refuge. But also later on, and this is something that I hope will come out, because this is something that you can't really often find from looking with what I do often is looking with binoculars from the side of the road at someone's outbuildings, is that internally there was often strong rooms built as well. And I've found a couple of examples of those. Yeah, so the idea of refuge is really important, and that imperial context, it's got to ground a lot of what we're doing, and to work for us to work out what's unique about the Australian context, or how it unfolds in Australia.
We've got a question here from Adele, who's wondering if you will also be looking at the broader landscape, for example, how the placement of buildings or sudden changes in construction materials and spatial patterns can be looked at in terms of reactions to real or perceived rebellions and attacks.
Yeah, definitely. Like I briefly mentioned the choice of a hill as a defensive location, and this crops up everywhere in the 1830s. Um, the Cameron seems to have lost his internet connection. Sorry
Oh,
about that. You're stuck with me. Um, I've also come across um, air, the families that settled that took up land near each other um, for defensive purposes. It was a defensive network, and they talk about it as such. A lot of the squatters who pushed out outside the limits of location in the 1830s also decided to set up on either side of a river so they could communicate with each other in case of an attack.
yeah,
So I think these are really, going to add a lot to that whole. It's it's not so much about finding rifle slits in stone buildings, but all the other elements will really add to the argument. And I think that's part of the Australian context. It's not as classical as elsewhere, as classical fortifications and works as elsewhere. It's very much on the edge, trying to make do. Um, and hasty works. They call there was hasty works built at Appin around one of the homesteads when they were under threat. So, evidence of hasty, post and rail kind of fence works as a defensive location
yeah,
would be really interesting to find.
yeah. Well, you two have certainly got your work cut out. But it really is a fascinating and an important, a very important project to sort of as part of that, engaging in what was happening rather than the Hardy Wilson side of the story, actually looking beyond that to the reality of what was going on. So I commend both of you. So on behalf of, we've got some comments coming in. Where are we? Yep. I think it was a nervous landscape. This is from Caitlin on landscape on many fronts, and some of the settlers were also worried about the Irish convicts at various points. The government certainly was. There is evidence for some of the government fortifications in the harbour relating to the inward-looking fear. So I think generally, yes, it wasn't a bucolic sort of peaceful sort of settlement, was it? It was actually,
I mean,
Uh,
you've framed some of your work, Stephen, through where's the uprising, Vinegar Hill, and that's an Irish rebellion, isn't it?
yep. Yeah.
So,
sorry,
so it's clearly,
I'm-
and there's clearly, and as you've noted throughout this, there's this question of any, sometimes it's called a double functioning element. It's a people might have been to a New South Wales high school that had um, uh, a kind of landmark at the centre of it, which was also a sort of waste disposal system chimney, and there's the history of architecture is full of exactly that, things that are not one thing or the other, that they actually are doing, that they speak in two different directions, so that we don't have to find only evidence for things that mean one thing, because sometimes they're more than one thing.
Yeah.
And so that might be the element, and there might be more than one social or historical context that is also driving fortification, whether that's, escaped convict, um, Irish rebellion, or connections between those two things, or uh, insecurity with relation to First Nations people. These things are, and so unpicking that's tricky, but I think it's still worth worth looking at it more carefully, and not just sort of ignoring those buildings that are at the back of the big house, as it were, for what they can tell us.
Yeah, so that's so true. And that idea of dual function and um, double threat or triple threat in the 1830s, interestingly, it was really important to the colonial authorities that there was this big spate of bushrangers um, allying with warriors. And this was considered to be a huge threat because, you know, um, you'd have guns and spears, you'd have knowledge and knowledge of Europeans, and it was a huge threat that was clamped down on really swiftly in the 1830s.
Yeah. Um, okay, so here we go. This is from Dan Winwood. The nervousness provides an interesting context for the Crown settling army veterans and their families in fencible villages around Auckland in the 1840s, awarding land on the provision that they were drilled in the readiness for attack on a weekly basis. So,
Yeah. It in similar ways it occurs in the Australian frontier in that many of the squatters or the head stockmen, overseers, ex-military. Ex-military early on in the colony, military are encouraged to take up grants to stiffen the frontier, to literally stiffen their defences. So it's just as prominent, I think, in probably in New Zealand and elsewhere, that military like presence on the frontier is really important and is fostered and sanctioned and rewarded by the colonial authorities.
yeah.
It strikes me that perhaps what from Dan's input, we should be thinking about the Greater New South Wales that included Aotearoa for some years, and thinking a little bit about that. Maybe anyway, we probably need to do a little bit more work with some people who know some stuff about that territory than we do. But yeah.
Dennis has made a comment here that the placement of the Veterans Corps settlements in New South Wales, in the New South Wales hinterland in the 1820s, might also be useful to look at. Although from memory, they were laid out as regular townships, and he doesn't recall any hard points in their design. So looking at settling in the towns that are established in the 18th.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. When you've got so many ex-military as part of that settlement, they've got a defensive mindset, and their thinking is around first and foremost, you know, military issues. So I think, that hasn't been really understood.
Yes, I must admit, you've opened up my eyes at looking at a few things in a different way now. Yeah, definitely. Definitely with this talk. Yeah.
Yeah, and even stuff in Uprising, that Stephen's most recent book, which I was just in my week off I had recently in the coast, I was getting into a bit more. The stuff about the cavalry in that book's really interesting too, and about the ways in which just the sort of meanings of uh, martial life in the colony, stuff I wasn't certainly conscious of, the sort of some of those social and cultural markers, and how that is a pervasive aspect that I suppose needs to be better understood spatially in terms of where people encountered um, those kind of figures, and how those kind of forms of power were projected. So in ways that in Dennis is alluding to here, it's not just as Steve mentioned before, a fortified stone building. It's where do people encounter the settlements of the core? How does that relate to what we know about conflict that's in the archive? There are other spatial evidence that can reinforce or speak back against the the
Just
textual archive, I guess.
and
Yeah.
just on that point, I mean, I think we'll probably explore more about this idea of the nervousness, but it was the late historian Lyndall Ryan who made the point that she did the Colonial Frontiers Massacre Map project. She led that, and she makes the point that the massacre is actually a sign of weakness. not a sign of strength, that response. And that's what you see all the time when Europeans are threatened on the frontier. They turn to the tactic of massacre as a tactic of shock and awe. So it's a sign of weakness. And I think there's going to be some kind of relationship between that and what they do when they start to build on the land that they've taken.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No, you look, I really, in another 2 or 3 years, I really do hope you can come back and present some, the research and where the project's gone in that time, because I think what's exciting for us is being right there at the sort of start of it when you're gathering that information, and certainly getting that message out so people can get some information and things to you.
And
Like you
we'll get some wild goose chases where people go, oh, there's those turret towers on that colonial mansion that was built in the 1880s.
Yeah.
You know, we'll get quite a few of those, but that's okay.
All right, because there'll be some gems in amongst that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what you've got to remember. Look, on behalf of ASHA, I would like to thank you too for a fascinating and really interesting talk that you've given tonight. Yes, so thank you. Do contact people zooming in. Do contact Stephen and Cameron if you do have, ideally not wild goose chases. They're not really the turrets on the 1880s houses, but if you do know, if you've done an assessment somewhere and you've noticed something with outbuildings, then please do get in contact with them. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.